He was a recluse when I first met him, yeah, and the world has changed.
He comes from an unconventional path, so in a way that's freedom to follow unconventional developments, which is brilliant.
I don't think I could ever be an abstract painter because of the suddenness and the lack of clarity sometimes, for me anyway. So my problem, if I have one, is knowing when to stop. And detail is something that comes natural to me. Perhaps that's due to my past career, I'm not sure, but I don't necessarily want to paint realism or super realism, but I want to reflect the detail in the paintings that I do, and I think I've been fairly consistent in doing that with most of my work. The first portrait I did was of my wife Kathy, but instead of painting her face, I painted the back of her head because she has this wonderful hairstyle and jewellery that she wears that interested me.
When we first met about 9 years ago, and obviously talking about each other's interests, he talked about art a lot, how he loved art, but then along comes family, children, work, and he almost gave up the sort of paintings. He had a few, but it had been one of these distant dreams, and he talked about when we retire, I'm going to start again. So we retired about 6 years ago, and that Christmas I went into town, didn't tell him anything about it, but got him this surprise easel for his Christmas present, which was pristine and beautiful at the time, and now all the marks of the paint and the dirt and the artist, and he's been using it ever since then.
When I was at school, like many other young people, are influenced greatly by their teachers, and my art teacher, Mr. McIntosh, was very encouraging towards myself and felt that I should take my art further, and he suggested that I apply to get into art school. So I went down to London after I left school with my portfolio. However, it was at a time when, as I was approaching the doors of the art school, all the students were walking out. And that was because it was during the 60s when the student revolts were taking place in London and Paris and various other parts of the world. And so instead of going to art school, I joined those rebels, if you like. Circumstances brought me back to Glasgow, where I was in a situation where I needed to find work, and so the first job I was offered was in a pathology department in the Western Infirmary, curating the pathology museum. And that led me into the post-mortem room quite often to collect specimens for the museum. And one day the pathologist working on a patient asked me if I had a system at the PM, which I did, and I found that really fascinating on a couple of levels. One, the extent that the pathologist went to establish exactly how the person had died, looking for any other pathology contained in the patient. But also it gave, for me, for the first time, a look at I think I felt privileged to be able to look inside a human being and see how wondrous it was, how it's made up and how it works and so on. If I were to reflect back to my childhood, in the 50s, when going to the cinema, it was very common to see newsreels of the discovery of the concentration camps and how those victims had suffered and died. And I don't suppose that would be allowed to be viewed today by children in cinemas, but it had a huge impact on me, how on earth two things. One, the Holocaust had came about, and to how those people who had to clear up the mess that was left behind by the Nazis, how they could do that. And that kind of fascinated me, I suppose, and was locked into my memory bank for many years, so that when I first encountered a person who had died, it was a very strange feeling, but a bit like the painting, the image tends to be diluted by the scientific approach that we have to establishing why that person had died, and that kind of takes over the assault on your optic nerves, if you like. As I went through every type of death, from someone who died of natural causes to someone who'd been who'd suffered a traumatic death, in the lead up to the work for the UN, whilst I wasn't prepared for the sheer numbers, I was able to cope with that probably far better than most of the other teammates. In 1995, in northern Bosnia, aerial photographs discovered mass graves. I was asked to join the first team of international specialists in forensic work to go out to that area to assist with the gathering of evidence of either war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And when I first went out there, I was taken aback by the enormity of it. Whilst I had worked with death for 30 odd years beforehand, I had never come up against anything on the scale. And the additional element that made it slightly more traumatic was that the victims' families believed that their loved ones were still alive and in work camps, possibly in Serbia. And so they would appear every day at the gates of the temporary mortuary looking for some kind of information about their loved ones. And when they discovered that, that their children, their husbands, fathers were dead, added to the daily trauma of going to work. And so the women of Srebrenica were there in the morning when we arrived. They waited all day for any news of their loved ones, and they would be there in the evening when we left. And I felt quite guilty that we couldn't really help them because we were there to establish evidence for the courts. Identification in the early days wasn't something that we were able to do. One of the most distressing elements of the Srebrenica genocide was that the Serbs, on realising that international teams were coming out to, were coming after them basically, they re-entered the original primary graves. They removed all the bodies from those graves, tore them apart using mechanical diggers, and then dispersed them, or the body parts, throughout northern Bosnia in places where they thought we would never find them, or if we did, we would never be able to put them together again. In fact, that side of it has been a major forensic achievement because of the 8,500 who were killed. 6,500 bodies have been put together again and positively identified, so that the families can finally, after 20 odd years, go to a place where they can visit the graves of their loved ones, instead of in these horrible places that are mass graves. And when you see into one for the first time, your first thought is that you have to get them out of there and give them some dignity and respect in death, if only for the sake of the families. If we've achieved anything, I feel that's something that we've done to help the families.
The work he'd done, obviously, in Bosnia was pretty horrific. And quite frequently he would wake up in the middle of the night shouting or screaming, and his body almost sort of shaking. And he talked me through, it was just the nightmares of the experiences that he'd had, and one particular horrendous one where he was lowered to try and get a tally of the bodies into this container, and he was dropped by mistake and ended up in this container of dead bodies. And that is a particularly vivid one that I know used to come to him, and he used to shout and scream and shake. But since he started doing particularly the paintings about Bosnia that were in the Witness exhibition, there's been a major reduction in those nightmares. The paintings had an incredibly cathartic effect upon him. And I won't say he never has them, but they are significantly reduced since then.
We devised a project called What's in a Mile, where we invited professional and non-professionals an opportunity to exhibit anything creative they were producing if they lived or worked within a mile radius of Iota. So a very interesting lady came in one day and said, "My husband paints and I think he's quite good, but he's a bit shy." So we said, "Perfect, bring him down with some of his work and I'm sure we'll be interested."
He was, "Oh my God, what have you done?" But we took 3 of them down and they looked at them, and I can remember Duncan saying, "This is the work of an artist." And Robert's face, my goodness, nobody's ever said that to me before. And that's the beginning of the journey that he's still on. Yeah, that was incredible. They have been brilliant.
He was very unassuming and frankly was asking, "Do I have talent?" Quite clearly. So with the background history of Robert's professional work as a forensic technician, we were asking more about that, and then he told us about Bosnia and so on, and mentioned that he had done some paintings regarding that work. So we invited ourselves around to his house to see these paintings, and as soon as we saw them, we knew it was an important job that Iota should do, was to get these works out of that house and into public view, for 2 reasons: because of the history of the work and the humanitarian aspect to it, but also because this was clearly a talent that was exactly what we've been talking about, that talent that exists that doesn't have an opportunity to be seen. He had never had any intention of showing this work. It had simply been a means for him to exorcise the ghosts, to express his own dismay and terror at what he'd seen, frankly. So he had never seen, he'd never considered, never thought that this work would go outside of the house, actually. So initially we offered him an exhibition here, but we knew we were intent on finding a bigger venue than our little corner shop. It was important that a wider public saw it, which was why we took it to the Mitchell, where it was seen by a great number of people, as it should have been.
There's a painting called the Srebrenica Line that I think sort of captures in some detail what I did as part of my job in gathering the evidence. And it's a painting, in fact, of a colleague of mine, and when you look at it, at first it's a woman hanging out washing, and to look at it in a bit more detail, you see that the woman's wearing theatre scrubs, and the clothing is, some of it's quite tattered, and there's also a blindfold in the painting, and there's a child's shoe, because it wasn't only the men that were killed in that genocide. The women were treated abysmally. Many of them were brutally raped and murdered, and so too were children. And there's been many witness statements to that effect. As a technician, part of my job, as well as assisting the pathologist and the anthropologist, was to gather the clothing and examine that.
This This was an unusual war artist scenario where Robert was not commissioned as an artist to go and paint these things. Robert experienced what he experienced in Srebrenica and so on, and other sites across the world, but needed as a human to come back and express them. And this is the job of an artist. An artist's job is to see and report back.
The man in the blindfold, that painting is called Witness because the victim is looking out at the viewer and as if to say that I am the witness, and what will be found will reveal exactly what happened to that man. And so when the victims were blindfolded, it did puzzle the team at first as to why that was the case, and it turned out that they would take groups of men and boys of about 20 or 30 at a time to a field where they were murdering the population, and they felt that if the Serbs felt that if the victims saw what was in front of them, it would disrupt the killing. So they had no idea really when they came off the buses what was facing them, and hence the blindfolds. I wanted to try and educate people in this country that I knew about what had happened there, because when I first returned from Bosnia after a month or so working out there, I was shocked that it wasn't what we had witnessed wasn't in the front pages of all the newspapers. During the Parliament exhibition that I had last month, a young woman who works in the Parliament from the canteen came up in her pinny, and it turned out that she escaped from Bosnia as a 14-year-old with her mum and dad who had been in the concentration camps there, and she looked at the paintings and told me that she knows that I understand what the people went through, and I felt that of all the people that I met in the Parliament, she was the one that stood out to me as being the most important in all of this, and that's to remember the fact of what these people had gone through. When I paint, I try to continue the process of producing a painting as far as I can possibly take it. And so detail is quite important to me, and it doesn't bother me at all to sit with one tiny piece of a painting and work on it sometimes for days. I feel like a kid in a sweetie shop because all of those years of not being involved in paintings has given me so much that I've locked into my head. I feel there's still work I can do with the Bosnian situation, where there's some stories to be told through painting some of those people. Although I would say that I'm still learning, I don't fret about challenges now. In fact, I welcome them, because every time I do something different, I learn a lot from that, and I think I'm close to the stage where I can paint now for pure enjoyment, and that was what I'd set out to do.